No one flinched when the lights above the grand sconces pulsed ever so slightly, nor when the string quartet skipped half a note mid-measure in the Ander atrium. The evening glided on, polished and ritualized, an event curated for elegance, not scrutiny. But then came a voice, soft and calculated, piercing velvet air like a threading needle. "Oh, housekeeping, how bold of them to wander this far." The sentence floated, light as lace, yet shaped to cut. Claire Winters Marchand didn't need to look at her target. The choreography of insult was rehearsed, perfected. The laughter it stirred from those near her was muted and satisfied. Malia Fredricks stood just beyond the circle of soft gold light cast by the overhead chandeliers. She wore no insignia, no floral gown, no gleaming pendant to mark her belonging. Only a tailored deep green suit, a soft silk scarf knotted effortlessly at the collar, and a closed leather folio resting against her hip. Her posture was unshaken. Her silence wasn't defensive, it was purposeful. She didn't meet Claire's gaze. She didn't scan the room for validation, and she certainly didn't smile. Around Claire, polite murmurs followed, barely veiled amusement from those drawn to the center of gravity she so often controlled. One man raised his flute toward another in mock salute. "Didn't know logistics briefings were happening during cocktail hour," he whispered. Another responded, "Bit off route from the service wing, don't you think?" Their commentary, while casual, was built to echo, designed to confirm what Claire never had to say out loud. This space belonged to a certain few. Everyone else was tolerable only when invisible. Malia didn't speak. She didn't move. But the lack of reaction itself began to thicken the air. A pause, a near imperceptible beat, crawled into the background music. A server's step hesitated near the oyster bar. From the mezzanine, one of the junior AV techs adjusted his shoulder strap, though nothing had slipped. It wasn't noise that changed the room. It was recalibration. Malia's presence, silent and composed, began to affect the angles of perception around her. Across the room, Nina Espina lowered her camera slightly. She had been framing a sponsor's centerpiece, some absurd fusion of desert succulents and imported ice orchids. But her lens found itself tilting toward the woman in green, not by instruction, but by instinct. The lighting hadn't changed, yet something in the center of the frame no longer made sense without including Malia. She paused, recalibrated exposure, and widened her shot. In the far left corridor, Darius Kincaid adjusted his stance, subtly. It wasn't alertness, not yet. Just the quiet instinct of someone trained to feel shifts before they formed shape. Years of managing risk in high-net environments had taught him this. Sometimes control doesn't leave with noise, it leaves with stillness. He didn't look at Malia directly. He watched the field around her, the microsignals that come when authority, even unspoken, begins to reconfigure the hierarchy of attention. Kai Masuda, stationed discreetly near a mirrored alcove, kept moving, but slower now. He wasn't sure what had occurred. He hadn't caught the words. But something in the room's cadence had altered, as if one of the pillars had rotated a fraction off axis. He didn't stop. He just steadied his tray with both hands, as if anticipating turbulence without knowing the source. Back in Claire's circle, the mood remained ostensibly intact. Glasses clinked. Smiles persisted. But they had become performative, a little sharper, a little tighter. The kind of smiles used to hold ground, not to enjoy company. Claire herself sipped from her crystal coupe as though nothing had changed. But her peripheral awareness betrayed her. She could sense it, the way the room's alignment was no longer cleanly hers. Malia hadn't moved an inch. Her presence was still, deliberate, not asserting, observing. The folio hadn't left her hip. Her hands hadn't fidgeted. But the attention in the room, subtle and diffused, had begun turning. Not everyone noticed, not consciously, but those attuned to power felt it. The recalibration was underway, and it hadn't asked for permission. Far beyond the gaze of most, in a side corridor near the archival exhibit, a discreet exchange flickered in earpieces. No urgency, no alarm, just a status check. Routine, but late. Something had altered timing. And in operations of this scale, altered timing never came from nowhere. Malia Fredricks wasn't wearing authority. She was emanating it. And the room, whether it liked it or not, had started to rotate around her. The hum of conversation persisted, but it no longer flowed. It stuttered in places, changed keys. At first it was minor. A misplaced inflection here, a pause a half-second too long there. But for those trained to notice atmospheric integrity, the shift was undeniable. Nina Espina, still near the central columns, narrowed her frame and zoomed slightly. The focus wasn't just Malia anymore. It was the space around her, the soft warping of social gravity. Malia hadn't moved, but the frame somehow required her presence. Nina didn't ask why. She adjusted and clicked. Kai Masuda turned toward the south aisle, tray balanced and steady. But his steps had changed rhythm. The easy, casual pace he maintained to match gala protocol had slowed just enough to notice. He wasn't stalling. He was sinking to a tempo the rest of the room hadn't caught up with. His fingers rested lighter against the stemware now. Not from tension, but from alertness. Something unseen had taken weight inside the evening. Near the main floral installation, a fashion consultant paused mid-compliment. Her gaze shifted slightly, not toward Malia, but in the space around her, as if catching a scent without knowing its source. The compliment finished half a breath too late. The guest she addressed nodded, but their focus had already drifted. Moments that should have connected were misfiring. The room's cohesion was softening. Darius Kincaid noticed none of this overtly. His training wasn't built on visuals. It was built on feel. And the feel was clear. Whatever rhythm had been established in the first hour of the event had subtly detuned, like a metronome offset by half a beat. He tapped a quiet command into his wrist device, not an alarm, just a soft sync. His team wouldn't react outwardly, but they'd adjust posture. Not because of a threat, because of a presence. Claire Winters Marchand continued her social orbit without breaking stride. Her laughter landed in curated waves, her gestures timed to applause and wine top-offs. But there was an undercurrent in her expression, a fractional squint in one eye, a twitch in the fingers that adjusted her bracelet. She was aware, in the way those raised in power always are, that something was slipping. Not by confrontation, by redirection. Malia Fredricks had not lifted her chin, not altered her stance. She stood as she had minutes earlier, near the marble archway, detached yet central. Her folio remained against her hip. Her scarf hadn't shifted. But her energy, so restrained and internalized, had begun to assert itself without performance. And the room, whether trying to resist it or trying to understand it, couldn't help but drift toward her alignment. From a rear operations terminal, a senior protocol coordinator blinked twice at her screen. Not at a warning or a breach, but at a timing anomaly. A scheduled sequence had delayed by 3 seconds. The delay wasn't visible to the guests. But in systems that tracked interactional pacing and PR touchpoints, that kind of disruption meant a thread had been pulled somewhere subtle. She flagged it quietly, not for escalation, but for observation. In one of the upper alcoves, a board member from a major shipping fund turned slightly. He wasn't looking at Malia. Not exactly. But his body adjusted. A small shift that made room in the visual corridor where she stood. No words, no engagement. But in architecture, even space is communication. And she now occupied a corridor of presence. Nina continued to shoot, slower now. Less fashion, more geometry. The way light struck Malia's shoulder from above and blurred down across the mirrored floor, there was symmetry there. Unintended maybe, but symmetry speaks louder than intention when systems begin to bend. She captured it, again and again, not for beauty, for evidence. the quartet resumed their set. Same arrangement, same instruments. But the sound had changed. It wasn't broken. It was diffused. Like it no longer anchored the space. Like it was trying to follow something else. No conductor had given new cues, but the tempo of perception had moved. And wherever that tempo was going, it was moving through Malia Fredricks first. Darius Kincaid had worked venues larger than this, galas with satellite security feeds and perimeter drones. But he didn't rely on hardware when the atmosphere itself began to change. His body adjusted before his mind did. Just a slight tilt of weight to the opposite leg, a millimeter shift in the line of sight. Not suspicion, recognition. He had felt this before, in boardrooms moments before walkouts, in lounges before sudden resignations. Not volatility, but the static before clarity. At the mezzanine bar, a venture liaison from Elwyn Capital rechecked her watch, not because she had somewhere to be, but because her sense of when things were supposed to happen no longer felt calibrated. The champagne in her flute still bubbled. Her smile stayed courteous, but something in her gaze faltered. She blinked twice, not out of confusion, but alignment. She could feel the air reweigh itself. Malia Fredricks didn't flinch. She had become stillness incarnate, neither frozen nor distant, just fully embedded without needing to assert her place. Her lack of response wasn't passive, it was directional. The folio at her side, untouched. Her scarf, motionless. But her very refusal to participate in the posturing had become a kind of posture itself, one that others now measured themselves against, even if they didn't know it yet. Near a carved oak partition, Kai Masuda turned slightly as he reset the tray position on his arm. The stemware chimed gently, but his eyes remained fixed, not on any guest in particular, but on the path his steps might cross if he continued forward. He hadn't been briefed on her. There had been no name, no directive, but her presence communicated something more absolute than protocol. He adjusted course, respectfully. Nina Espina repositioned again, this time standing more upright. Her camera now focused on interactional spacing, not faces, not reactions, but the distances growing between pairs who moments ago stood close. Microfractures had appeared in proximity. People adjusting without speaking, forming subtle tributaries of attention around a presence they hadn't formally acknowledged. She didn't label it. She just recorded. A publicist whispered to a gallery investor in the East Wing, "What's her role again?" But the question lacked tension. It was more like seeking coordinates on a shifting map. The investor didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted his jacket, as if that alone might delay answering something his instincts weren't ready to frame. They both looked forward again, eyes casually sweeping, but not back to Claire. Claire Winters Marchand noticed, of course, not in loud betrayals, but in the softness of disloyalty. Her circle still stood near, still smiled, still nodded. But the kinetic flow had altered. The way someone turned their chin, the way another now checked the mezzanine. These weren't defections, not yet, but they were preambles. Claire's grip on her crystal glass tightened imperceptibly. Darius scanned the room differently now. He didn't look for threats. He looked for origin points. There had been no disruption, no breach, no external signal. But this wasn't ambient. It was patterned. And in high-control environments, a pattern without precedent was a message. He didn't know what Malia was carrying or who had authorized her presence, but her silence now pulsed with intent, not to interrupt, to anchor. Across the room, the event's head of guest logistics tapped her headset softly. A timing cascade in the itinerary software had just flagged an unknown delay in a secondary sponsor queue. Nothing visible to guests. But if left unresolved, it would interfere with staggered acknowledgement sequences later in the evening. The system was adjusting, but not due to human error. The sequence was reacting to behavior, and behavior was reacting to Malia. Kai passed behind a vendor table and paused. not for the guests, but to reposition a glass that was never out of place. His motion was precise, quiet, but unnecessary. He needed a buffer, a moment to recalibrate. His heart wasn't racing, but his mind was busy catching up to what his body already knew. Something had entered the structure, not to disturb it, to redefine it. Claire descended from the dais with a grace born not of humility, but of ownership. Her heels touched marble like punctuation marks, each step paced for precision, not performance. In her hand, folded once and held delicately enough to project disdain without aggression, was a piece of thick ivory paper, torn clean through. The Marchand Holdings emblem glimmered on the corner. Below it, only half a name remained visible. The gesture was clear. This document had once acknowledged someone's presence. Now it no longer did. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The paper was meant to do the speaking for her. Claire held it not toward Malia Fredricks directly, but at a slight angle, just high enough for nearby guests to see. It was a presentation, curated and theatrical, designed to reinforce hierarchy without confrontation. A performance dressed as an oversight correction. Malia did not react. She didn't glance at the document, nor at the woman wielding it like a warrant. Her stillness wasn't defiance. It was diagnostic. The lack of reaction disassembled the moment faster than any reply could. Claire thought she was defining the situation. What she had done, in truth, was reveal uncertainty. Her power was no longer traveling through the room. It was circling back on itself. To the right, a legal director in midnight blue took half a step back, not overtly, just enough to reframe his alignment. His eyes tracked Malia, not Claire. Next to him, a political consultant lowered her glass too carefully. These weren't allies being made. These were loyalties hesitating. Nina didn't move her lens. She just widened it. The frame now held 3 focal points: Claire's poised attack, Malia's unmoved posture, and the audience pretending not to watch. The torn document flickered in focus, a symbol meant to dominate but now demoted to prop. She clicked silently. This wasn't fashion. This was signal architecture. Darius Kincaid shifted forward a few feet, not aggressively, not even protectively, just enough to mark territory. His position now made him a subtle barrier, not between people but between claims of authority. He didn't speak into his mic. He didn't give any commands, but the staff along the mezzanine shifted posture all the same. Respect followed observation, not instruction. Kai Masuda caught the movement in his peripheral vision. His tray remained level, but the trajectory of his route adjusted again. He didn't know what the paper was, but he knew the gesture. He had seen it in boardrooms where status was defended with ceremony when substance had already left the table. His eyes darted once toward Malia, then back to the floor. Across the hall, a hedge fund director whispered something to a peer from maritime transport. It wasn't loud, it wasn't reactive, but it contained a new tension, the kind that questioned structure, not safety, but alignment. Their words didn't reach Malia, but their direction had changed, and in these rooms, direction is currency. Claire stood still, paper still aloft. She waited, but the beat didn't land. There was no gasp, no murmur of consensus, just the quiet shifting of weight, the recalculation of social vectors. Her moment, crafted so precisely, had no place to land, because the axis of orientation had already moved, and it hadn't waited for applause. Malia Fredricks remained motionless, not frozen, grounded. The insult had not diminished her. It had failed to register on her frequency. She wasn't ignoring Claire. She had simply registered the moment as structurally irrelevant. And that is what made it dangerous. Not because it provoked conflict, but because it rendered challenge obsolete. From the far end of the atrium, Rupert Marchand entered with the posture of legacy embodied. No need for urgency. His presence alone had long been calibrated to restore equilibrium. A tailored navy suit hugged his frame, a gold tie pin catching ambient light with every step. He did not look at Claire. He did not ask what the paper meant. His attention settled directly on Malia Fredricks, as though expecting recognition without having earned it. He spoke softly, the kind of voice passed down through estates and board appointments. "You may be a bit out of alignment with the intended seating," he said. There was no overt insult in his tone, just the calibrated authority of someone who believed their name still held gravitational pull. It wasn't instruction, it was declaration, disguised as politeness. Malia didn't blink. The folio remained closed at her side, her scarf still intact. She didn't acknowledge Rupert, nor his tone. But her silence shifted. It deepened. What had once been observation now registered as examination. The space between his words and her stillness widened, not into confrontation, but into quiet indictment. She wasn't out of alignment. The room was. Darius Kincaid repositioned slightly, just enough to cast a visible line between the two figures. His stance didn't warn, it forecast. He didn't intervene. But his placement now suggested that some thresholds, while invisible, were absolute. Rupert noticed, even if he didn't respond. Old power could always sense when it was being buffered. Nina tracked the shift through her lens. The camera didn't shake. It absorbed. Rupert had entered like a closing bracket, meant to contain the unfolding tension. But the narrative had already rerouted. His gesture, his presence, even his tone, didn't reset the structure. They underscored its obsolescence. The lens pulled back slightly, framing him less like a solution and more like a monument being photographed at dusk. In the mezzanine lounge, a regional logistics executive tapped their earpiece. A staggered update had just arrived, an internal alert about sponsor sequence changes, redrafted without prior notice. The information wasn't alarming, but the source of the change was unclear. That ambiguity in elite systems carried weight. Shifts without attribution were rarely accidents. Kai Masuda, now circling the dessert wing, felt the cadence again. He passed a table of florists and paused, not because he had a task, but because the room's perimeter had redrawn itself. He stood near the edge of Malia's visual radius now, and from that vantage, everything, Claire, Rupert, even the guests behind them, seemed less central. Not gone, just reduced. Rupert Marchand did not press. He wasn't the type to insist out loud, but his expression began to harden, not into anger, but into disappointment, the kind reserved for systems that no longer responded to their architect. He had arrived to restore order, and order had responded with silence. Malia still had not spoken. She didn't lift her chin or sharpen her posture, but something behind her gaze made the silence feel less like absence and more like filtration. Rupert's presence didn't fill the room, it was being measured by it, and throughout the gallery, the ripple continued. Guests in unrelated conversations shifted tone. Micro-groups adjusted formation, no declarations, no sides taken. Just the invisible, instinctual pull that follows realignment. Malia Fredricks hadn't asserted dominance, but the room had begun to behave as though she already had it. Malia Fredricks remained poised, unmoved. Her eyes didn't waver. She didn't address Rupert. She didn't even glance toward Claire. But her hand moved, just once. A slow, deliberate tap against the edge of her leather folio. It was not dramatic. It wasn't even noticeable to most. But for those who lived by the cadence of coordination, it was unmistakable. A mark had been given. In her earpiece, nearly imperceptible, came a calm voice. Protocol engaged. Initial clearances confirmed. Phase indicators live. Malia didn't reply. She didn't need to. That single touch had been enough to set the system in motion. Not a scene, a sequence. On the balcony above the archival wall, a discreet analyst monitoring social engagement data saw a drop, not in sentiment, but in cohesion. Tags normally aligned with Claire and Rupert had begun to disassociate. Mentions drifted, focus migrated. The narrative tide, once stable, was quietly breaking apart. In the crowd, Nina Espina lowered her camera. Not from disinterest, from signal saturation. Every frame she shot now carried the same weight. Malia at still point, Claire diminishing, Rupert static. It was no longer a story in development. It was a pivot point. What followed would be aftermath. Kai Masuda's phone buzzed in his pocket, a soft signal from one of the internal comms groups he quietly followed. Not public news, just back-end market indicators, the kind that didn't show headlines but movement. His eyes narrowed slightly. A shift had registered in one of the commodity indexes linked to Marchand Holdings, not a collapse, a distancing. Darius Kincaid didn't react outwardly, but his eyes tracked the soft reshuffle happening across the periphery. Event staff near access points subtly updated their hand signals. His internal clock recalibrated. Not for safety, for structure. Whatever had been running quietly behind the scenes was now influencing real-world motion. A handoff was occurring, not of authority, but of command language. Rupert Marchand adjusted his cufflink, not out of anxiety, but to reclaim rhythm. The action, once seen as deliberate confidence, now looked like delay, as if his gestures were trying to re-establish a tempo the room had already outgrown. Claire, a step behind him, offered no support. Her silence was no longer poised. It was stranded. A communications advisor near the program table reviewed her update dashboard. 4 partnerships, previously aligned with Marchand projects, had staggered their tags, no public announcement. But she knew how reputation recalibrated. Quietly, with absence. The kind that wasn't announced. The kind that meant you were no longer required. Malia tapped the folio again. Once. Nothing theatrical. Just precision. In her ear came the next confirmation. Transition lock engaged. Distribution offset initiated. External signals remain staggered. Still, she said nothing aloud. Yet the signals kept multiplying. And so, without declaration or disruption, the retribution unfolded. Not as vengeance, but as architecture. Claire and Rupert had orchestrated attention. Malia had repurposed its foundation. She didn't dismantle their power. She rerouted the network that made it function. The shift didn't come as spectacle. It came like gravity, subtle, steady, and undeniable. Conversations softened. Guests realigned without words. The Marchands hadn't exited. They had simply lost orbit. Claire still held the torn paper, but it no longer carried meaning. Rupert, once unshakable, stood still, uncertain if silence was submission or transition. Around them, attention didn't collapse. It redirected. Malia Fredricks had moved nothing and said nothing, yet the architecture of influence had restructured itself around her. She hadn't claimed presence. She had become presence. The room, without decree or command, began to behave as if her position had always been central. Nina Espina adjusted to a wide shot. She wasn't capturing a confrontation. She was framing new order. Kai Masuda lingered by the marble column, not as staff, but as witness. The gala hadn't ended. It had been recoded. A producer deleted highlight tags with quiet certainty, not out of rebellion, but because the relevance had already shifted. Malia didn't seize power. She became the condition for how it moved. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. But if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly erased, then you already understand the truth behind this story. Real influence doesn't interrupt. It rearranges. It doesn't demand recognition. It becomes the reason people start paying attention. Subscribe if that speaks to you. Here, we don't chase moments. We build the axis they rotate around.